Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. 6 months ago, I thought I'd found the perfect place. A beautiful standalone house in what looked like an upscale planned community. Clean streets, well-maintained common areas, and houses that actually looked like people took pride in ownership. As a software engineer who'd finally saved enough for a decent down payment, it felt like I'd made it. What I didn't realize was that I'd moved into the middle of a power struggle that would end with handcuffs, hefty fines, and some very embarrassed wannabe authoritarians. Let me back up and explain how this whole mess started. When I was house hunting, my realtor made sure to point out that this wasn't technically an HOA community. Instead, it was what they called a Voluntary Neighborhood Association, or VNA. She explained that unlike a traditional HOA, the VNA couldn't actually enforce anything legally. They organized community events, maintained some shared walking trails, and published voluntary guidelines about keeping properties looking nice. The key word being voluntary. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted a nice neighborhood without some power-hungry board breathing down my neck about the exact shade of my mailbox or whether my trash cans were visible from the street for 30 seconds too long on pickup day. For the first few months, everything was great. I kept my property immaculate because I actually take pride in my home, not because anyone was forcing me to. My house is modern and minimalist, exactly how I like it. Clean lines, well-maintained landscaping, and a garage that I keep organized better than most people keep their living rooms. The problem started about 2 months ago when I decided to install a decorative solar light fixture near my driveway. It was a nice piece, nothing gaudy or inappropriate, just a sleek modern design that complemented my house perfectly. The thing was maybe 6 inches taller than what their voluntary guidelines suggested for landscape lighting. I say voluntary guidelines because that's exactly what they are. When I bought the house, I read every document carefully. The VNA has zero legal authority to enforce anything. They can ask nicely, they can suggest, they can even vote to disapprove of something, but they can't actually make you do anything about it. That didn't stop them from trying. The first letter arrived about a week after I installed the light. It came on official-looking letterhead from the VNA board, signed by someone who called herself the community president. The tone was friendly but firm, requesting that I adjust the height of my landscape lighting to comply with community standards. I read it, shrugged, and filed it away. My lighting was perfectly reasonable, well-designed, and not bothering anyone. More importantly, they had no legal right to demand I change it. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This one was less friendly. It used phrases like community compliance and property value protection, and mentioned something about a compliance review process. It was signed by both the community president and someone calling himself the neighborhood compliance officer. That one went in the trash. The third letter was where things got weird. It arrived with a return address that included an official-sounding title, Community Standards Enforcement Division. The letter itself was typed on heavier paper and used language that sounded almost legal. It mentioned inspection protocols and enforcement procedures and gave me a deadline to remedy the violation or face appropriate community sanctions. The whole thing was ridiculous. I did some research and confirmed what I already knew. This VNA had about as much legal authority as my book club. They could organize potluck dinners and coordinate trail maintenance, but they couldn't enforce anything beyond peer pressure. I decided to ignore them completely. If they wanted to waste their time and money sending me increasingly dramatic letters about a perfectly reasonable light fixture, that was their problem. That's when things escalated in a way I never could have predicted. Last month, I had to travel for a conference about 300 miles away. It was a 2-day thing, nothing urgent, just professional development that my company was paying for. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Before leaving, I double-checked my security system like I always do. I've got a pretty comprehensive setup with high-quality cameras covering both the exterior and interior of my garage, plus motion sensors and real-time alerts that ping my phone whenever anything triggers them. Living alone, I like knowing my property is secure when I'm away. I left on a Thursday morning and the conference was going great until Friday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from inside my garage. That was odd. The garage was locked, and I wasn't expecting any deliveries or service calls. I opened the security app on my phone and nearly dropped it when I saw what was happening. There were 3 people inside my garage, 3 people who definitely weren't supposed to be there. I recognized one of them immediately from the community newsletter photos. It was the guy who'd been signing those letters as the compliance officer, a thin man in his 30s who apparently had way too much time on his hands. He was wearing what looked like a cheap blue blazer with some kind of embroidered patch on it, and he had a lanyard around his neck with what appeared to be a badge. The other 2 I didn't recognize, but they were clearly with him. One was an older woman taking photos of my perfectly organized tool collection, and another was a middle-aged man with a clipboard who seemed to be in charge. But here's the thing that really got my blood boiling. The compliance officer guy was trying to open a locked filing cabinet I keep in the corner of my garage. It's where I store important documents, and it's clearly labeled private files. They weren't just snooping around my garage, they were actively trying to break into my personal property. I watched for another few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. The guy with the clipboard was talking, and even though I couldn't hear what he was saying through the camera, his body language made it clear he thought he was running some kind of official inspection. That's when I noticed the details that really mattered. The compliance officer's badge looked like something you could order online for $20. His blazer was too big and had obviously never been fitted properly. The older woman had a laminated card hanging from her jacket that said something about community patrol. None of it looked legitimate, but they were clearly trying to present themselves as having some kind of authority. I didn't waste time trying to confront them directly. Instead, I did exactly what any reasonable person should do when they discover strangers have broken into their property while impersonating officials. I called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher was professional and took my report seriously. I explained that 3 individuals claiming to be from our neighborhood association had illegally entered my locked garage and were currently inside attempting to conduct some kind of unauthorized inspection. I mentioned that one of them appeared to be wearing a badge and trying to impersonate an officer, and that I had them on live video. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line and said they were sending 2 patrol cars immediately. She also asked me to email the video footage to their evidence department right away, which I did from my phone while we were still talking. While I was waiting for the deputies to arrive, I decided to test something. My security system has a 2-way audio feature, so I can speak through a speaker in the garage if I need to. I kept my voice calm and quiet, just loud enough for the camera microphone to pick up clearly. The sheriff's department has been notified they are en route. The reaction was immediate and telling. All 3 of them froze. The older woman actually dropped the clipboard she was holding. The compliance officer looked around like he was trying to figure out where my voice was coming from. The man who seemed to be in charge started talking quickly to the others, obviously trying to figure out whether they should leave immediately or try to bluff their way through somehow. They decided to try to finish whatever they were doing quickly, which turned out to be a very bad decision. About 8 minutes later, my phone buzzed with another motion alert. This time it showed 2 sheriff's deputies entering my garage with their hands near their weapons. They'd obviously approached carefully and quietly, because the 3 trespassers had no idea they were there until one of the deputies said loudly, "Sheriff's Department, nobody move." What happened next was exactly what you'd expect when law enforcement finds people who've broken into someone's property. All 3 were immediately detained and told to keep their hands visible. The deputies were professional but firm, and they clearly weren't interested in hearing excuses. The man with the clipboard tried to take charge of the situation. He started talking about how they were community officers conducting a routine compliance inspection and had full authority to be there. He said something about HOA enforcement powers and property standards violations. That's when one of the deputies shut him down completely. The deputy looked directly at him and said that the property owner had already informed them this was a voluntary neighborhood association with no legal inspection authority whatsoever. He also pointed out that attempting to impersonate law enforcement was a serious criminal offense. The compliance officer tried to argue that his badge was legitimate, but when the deputy examined it, he found exactly what I expected. It was a cheap, generic community patrol badge that you could order online. Nothing official about it. The deputies searched their vehicle and found a collection of official-looking but completely invalid documents. They had inspection warrants and violation notices and enforcement orders, all printed on heavy paper with fancy fonts. None of it had any legal weight whatsoever, but it was clearly designed to intimidate people into thinking they had real authority. All 3 were arrested on the spot. The charges were criminal trespass for breaking into my garage, and the compliance officer got an additional charge of impersonating an officer because of the fake badge and official-looking documents. I was still 200 miles away watching this unfold on my phone, but I have to admit it was incredibly satisfying to see these wannabe authoritarians get exactly what they deserved. The deputies were thorough. They took photos of everything, collected all the fake documents as evidence, and made sure to get clear footage from my security cameras for their report. One of them called me directly to get my statement and to thank me for the high-quality video evidence that made their job much easier. By the time I drove home the next day, the whole community was buzzing with gossip about the arrest. Apparently, watching 3 community officials get handcuffed and put in the back of sheriff's department patrol cars had been quite the spectacle for my neighbors. But that was just the beginning. As soon as I got home, I started making phone calls. First, I called the sheriff's station to provide additional footage and to make sure they had everything they needed for a solid prosecution. The deputy I spoke with assured me that between the video evidence and the fake documents, they had an airtight case. Next, I called a lawyer who specialized in property law. I wanted to make absolutely sure I understood my rights and to explore what legal remedies I might have. The lawyer was fascinated by the case and agreed to send a cease and desist letter to the VNA board demanding they retract all their previous violation letters and acknowledge in writing that my property was not under their mandatory jurisdiction. I also called the county recorder's office to get official documentation of my property's legal status. I wanted everything in writing so there could be no future confusion about what authority, if any, this VNA actually had over my home. The lawyer's cease and desist letter was a thing of beauty. It laid out exactly what had happened, referenced the criminal charges, and made it crystal clear that any future harassment or attempted enforcement actions would result in additional legal consequences. It also demanded written acknowledgement that the VNA had no legal authority over my property and that all previous violation notices were invalid. The VNA board's response was predictably weak. They tried to hold an emergency meeting to distance themselves from the 3 arrested members, claiming they had acted without authorization. But the damage was done. Everyone in the community now knew that their enforcement authority was completely imaginary. The court case moved forward quickly. The county prosecutor took the charges seriously, especially the impersonation of an officer charge. Apparently, people trying to intimidate others with fake authority is something they see more often than you'd think, and they prosecute aggressively to discourage it. All 3 defendants tried to plea bargain, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in going easy on them. The evidence was too clear and the charges were too serious. They ended up pleading guilty to avoid going to trial, but they still faced significant consequences. The fines were substantial. Each of them was hit with several $1,000s in penalties for the criminal trespass charges. The compliance officer got an additional fine for impersonating an officer that brought his total to over $8,000. All 3 now have misdemeanor convictions on their criminal records. But the financial penalties were just the beginning. The judge also ordered them to pay restitution to me for my legal fees and for the cost of upgrading my security system. Since their break-in had shown a vulnerability in my garage security, I'd had a more advanced lock system installed with additional monitoring features. The total came to over $3,000 that they had to split between them. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order preventing any of them from setting foot on my property for any reason. If they want to walk down my street, they have to stay on the opposite sidewalk. Most satisfying of all, they were permanently banned from holding any position with the VNA. The community board voted unanimously to expel them and to revise their bylaws to make it clear that the VNA has no enforcement authority and that any attempt to impersonate officials would result in immediate expulsion and potential legal action. They were also required to submit formal, written apologies to me, which had to be notarized and made part of the public record. I have to admit, reading those letters was extremely satisfying. Watching these people who had tried to bully me into compliance suddenly become very apologetic and humble was worth all the hassle they'd put me through. The apologies were posted to the community forum and the neighborhood social media pages as part of the settlement agreement. Everyone in the area got to read about how 3 residents had illegally entered another resident's property while pretending to be officials, had been arrested and prosecuted, and were now apologizing for their criminal behavior. The impact on the VNA was immediate and dramatic. The remaining board members resigned in embarrassment, and the organization basically imploded. For several months, there was no community association at all. Eventually, a new group of residents stepped up to restart the VNA, but with a completely different approach. They made it explicitly clear that their role was limited to organizing social events and maintaining the walking trails. No enforcement, no inspections, no violation letters, just the kind of purely voluntary community organization it was supposed to be in the first place. As for my decorative light fixture, it's still exactly where I installed it, exactly the height I wanted it to be. I also added a new solar-powered sign near my garage that's perfectly compliant with all actual county regulations. It reads, "Private property, surveillance active, trespassers will be prosecuted." The sign serves 2 purposes. It warns off anyone else who might be confused about their authority over my property, and it reminds the whole community about what happens when people try to enforce imaginary rules through criminal behavior. My relationship with my neighbors has actually improved since all this happened. Apparently, a lot of people were getting tired of the VNA's increasingly aggressive tactics, but nobody wanted to be the first to push back. When word got around about how I'd handled the situation, several neighbors thanked me privately for standing up to what they called the mini-tyrants who'd been making everyone miserable. One neighbor told me she'd been planning to sell her house rather than deal with the constant harassment about her garden choices. Another said he'd been afraid to make any improvements to his property because he didn't want to attract the VNA's attention. Apparently, I wasn't the only one being targeted with bogus violation letters. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with bullies, whether they're in middle school or running fake community enforcement operations. Most of the time, they're counting on people being too intimidated or too busy to fight back. They use official-looking documents and authoritative language to make people think they have power they don't actually possess. But when you call their bluff and involve actual authorities, their fake power evaporates immediately. These three people went from acting like they owned the neighborhood to getting arrested, fined, and permanently banned from any community leadership role. The best part is that I didn't have to do anything dramatic or confrontational. I just documented what they were doing, called the appropriate authorities, and let the legal system handle the rest. Their own criminal behavior was what got them in trouble. I just made sure there were consequences for it. Looking back, I'm grateful for my security system and for staying calm when I discovered the break-in. It would have been easy to rush home and confront them directly, but that could have escalated the situation in dangerous ways. Instead, I had clear video evidence of everything they did, which made the prosecution straightforward and the outcome inevitable. The whole situation also reinforced my belief in following proper legal channels. These people were trying to intimidate me with fake authority, but real legal authority was on my side the entire time. Property rights, trespassing laws, and impersonation of officer statutes all worked exactly as they're supposed to. I've heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the three former VNA enforcers are still bitter about the whole thing. Apparently they think I overreacted by involving law enforcement instead of just going along with their demands. But that just shows they still don't understand what they did wrong. Breaking into someone's property while pretending to be officials isn't a minor community dispute that should be handled with a friendly conversation. It's serious criminal behavior that deserves serious legal consequences. The fact that they don't seem to understand that difference probably explains how they got into this mess in the first place. These days, my neighborhood is peaceful again. The new VNA organizes a few community events each year and maintains the trails, but they stay completely out of property enforcement. People take care of their homes because they want to, not because they're afraid of harassment from wannabe officials. My property values haven't suffered from having a 6-inch, too tall light fixture. My neighbors aren't complaining about my landscaping choices. The world didn't end because I refused to comply with voluntary guidelines from people with no authority to enforce them. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the most effective form of resistance is simply refusing to be intimidated and insisting that people follow the actual law instead of the rules they made up for themselves. The three former VNA officials wanted to play cops and robbers, but they found out that real police don't take kindly to imposters. They wanted to intimidate people with fake authority, but they discovered that real legal authority doesn't appreciate being mocked by criminals with laminated badges. In the end, they got exactly what they deserved, and I got to keep my light fixture exactly where I wanted it. Sometimes justice is that simple, but there's more to this story because the legal fallout from their arrest ended up having consequences I never could have anticipated. About 2 weeks after the court case was finalized, I got a call from the county attorney's office. Apparently, my case had prompted them to investigate other complaints they'd received about fake HOA enforcement in the area. It turned out that my three former neighbors weren't the only ones running around pretending to have authority they didn't possess. The prosecutor told me that over the past year, they'd gotten at least a dozen reports of people claiming to represent various homeowner associations or community groups while conducting unauthorized inspections or demanding compliance with made-up rules. Most of the time, residents had been too intimidated to file formal complaints, so the pattern hadn't been obvious until my case brought it to their attention. My security footage and the evidence collected from the fake officials had become part of a larger investigation into what the prosecutor called a pattern of fraudulent authority claims across multiple communities in the county. Apparently, the same basic script was being used in several different neighborhoods to pressure residents into compliance with voluntary guidelines that had no legal backing. The investigation revealed something that really surprised me. The compliance officer who'd broken into my garage wasn't just some overzealous neighbor with too much time on his hands. He'd actually been doing this in 3 different communities, using slightly different fake credentials each time. In one neighborhood, he called himself a municipal code inspector. In another, he was a property standards enforcement officer. In my community, he was the neighborhood compliance officer. The prosecutor showed me photos of multiple fake badges, official-looking documents, and even business cards this guy had been using to intimidate people across a huge area. idea. It was basically a small-scale fraud operation designed to trick homeowners into thinking they had to comply with voluntary guidelines or face legal consequences. What made it even worse was that he'd been accepting compliance fees from some residents who were scared enough to pay him rather than face whatever fake enforcement action he was threatening. The investigation found that he'd collected over $15,000 in bogus fines and fees over the past 18 months. That revelation turned my simple trespassing case into something much bigger. The county filed additional fraud and extortion charges against all three defendants, and suddenly my case was being used as evidence in a major prosecution that could result in felony convictions and serious jail time. The older woman who'd been taking photos in my garage turned out to be the compliance officer's mother, and she'd been helping him run the scam by playing the role of a senior community liaison in some neighborhoods and a documentation specialist in others. The man with the clipboard was her boyfriend, who'd been recruited to add credibility to their fake inspections by acting as the supervising official. When the expanded charges were filed, the defense attorneys tried to negotiate plea deals that would have resulted in much lighter sentences, but the prosecutor was having none of it. She told me that these kinds of fake authority scams were becoming a real problem nationwide, and she wanted to send a clear message that this behavior wouldn't be tolerated in our county. The new charges meant that instead of simple misdemeanors, all three defendants were facing potential felony convictions that could include significant jail time. The compliance officer, who was clearly the ringleader, was looking at up to 3 years in prison if convicted on all counts. That's when things got really interesting from my perspective. The defense team reached out through my lawyer to see if I'd be willing to support a reduced sentence in exchange for full restitution and a detailed confession about the scope of their operation. They wanted to avoid the risk of serious prison time by cooperating with the broader investigation. I wasn't particularly interested in helping them avoid consequences for their actions, but my lawyer explained that their cooperation could help identify other victims and potentially recover money that had been fraudulently collected from other homeowners. After thinking about it, I agreed to consider a recommendation for leniency if they provided complete information about their scam and made full restitution to all their victims. The confession they provided was eye-opening. It detailed exactly how they'd been targeting communities with voluntary neighborhood associations, researching property records to identify residents who might be vulnerable to intimidation, and systematically working their way through neighborhoods to extract compliance fees and enforce voluntary guidelines as if they were legal requirements. They'd been particularly successful in communities with older residents who were more likely to trust official-looking documents and less likely to research their rights or fight back against authority figures. The compliance officer admitted that he'd specifically chosen targets who seemed unlikely to involve law enforcement or hire lawyers to challenge his fake authority. Reading through their confession, I realized how lucky I'd been to have security cameras and to be comfortable with technology and legal research. If I'd been less tech-savvy or more trusting of official-looking documents, I might have ended up paying bogus fines just to avoid confrontation, never realizing I was being scammed. The confession also revealed that they'd been planning to escalate their operations in my neighborhood. My light fixture violation was supposed to be a test case to see how far they could push enforcement before residents started pushing back. If I'd backed down and paid their fake fines, they were planning to start targeting other residents with increasingly aggressive enforcement actions. In other words, my decision to ignore their letters and install security cameras probably prevented a lot of other people from being victimized by the same scam. The full scope of their operation became clear when the county started reaching out to other victims. Over 30 families had been targeted across 4 different communities, and total losses from fraudulent fees exceeded $50,000. Some people had paid hundreds of dollars in bogus fines to avoid having liens placed on their property, which of course was something these fake officials had no power to do anyway. The restitution process took several months to sort out, but eventually all the victims were contacted and arrangements were made for full repayment of any money that had been fraudulently collected. The 3 defendants had to liquidate personal assets and set up payment plans to cover the total amount owed. For my part, I ended up receiving not just restitution for my legal fees and security system upgrades, but also a portion of the assets that were seized during the investigation. The compliance officer had been driving a car that was purchased with money from his fake fine scheme, and when it was sold, the proceeds were distributed among his victims. The final court hearing was remarkably satisfying. All 3 defendants stood before the judge and formally apologized, not just to me, but to every victim they defrauded. The compliance officer in particular looked absolutely miserable as he admitted that his entire operation had been designed to trick people into thinking he had authority he didn't possess. The judge's comments during sentencing made it clear that this kind of fraud wouldn't be tolerated. She specifically mentioned that people who abuse fake authority to intimidate and defraud others deserve serious consequences, and that the court needed to send a message that would deter similar behavior. The final sentences were substantial. The compliance officer got 18 months in jail, 3 years of probation, and a permanent ban on working in any capacity related to community associations or property management. His mother got 6 months of home detention and 2 years of probation. Her boyfriend got 90 days in jail and 18 months of probation. All three were also required to pay substantial fines on top of the restitution, and their convictions were felonies that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The judge made it clear that any future attempts to impersonate officials or defraud residents would result in much harsher sentences. The impact on our community ended up being entirely positive. Once word spread about the arrests and prosecution, several other residents came forward to share their own experiences with the fake officials. It turned out that quite a few people had been intimidated into making property changes they didn't want to make, all because they trusted official-looking documents and authoritative-sounding titles. The new VNA that eventually formed made transparency and accountability their top priorities. They published clear guidelines about their actual authority, which is essentially none, and they created a formal process for residents to report any attempts at unauthorized enforcement. They also worked with the county sheriff's office to make sure everyone in the community knew how to report suspected fraud or impersonation. My security footage from the break-in was actually used by the sheriff's department for training purposes. They said it was a perfect example of how modern technology can provide the evidence needed to prosecute people who abuse fake authority, and they encourage other residents to consider similar systems for protecting their property. The whole experience changed how I think about community associations and voluntary organizations. I learned that the word voluntary means exactly what it says, and that no legitimate organization needs to use intimidation or fake authority to get compliance with their guidelines. I also learned that most people who try to bully others with fake authority are cowards who fold immediately when confronted with real legal consequences. These three people went from acting like they owned the entire neighborhood to begging for leniency once they realized they were facing serious criminal charges. The decorative light that started this whole mess is still exactly where I installed it, and it's never been brighter. Every time I see it, I'm reminded that standing up to bullies and insisting on following actual laws instead of made-up rules is always the right choice. My property values didn't suffer from my refusal to comply with voluntary guidelines. My neighbors didn't abandon the community because I insisted on my legal rights. The world didn't end because I refused to be intimidated by people with fake badges and laminated cards. Most importantly, I helped protect other residents from being victimized by the same scam that was used to target me. Sometimes the best way to help your community is to refuse to let criminals operate in it, even when they're wearing cheap blazers and calling themselves community officials. The final lesson from all of this is simple but important. Real authority doesn't need to rely on intimidation, fake documents, or breaking into people's property. Real officials have legitimate processes, proper identification, and legal backing for their actions. Anyone who has to resort to criminal behavior to enforce their authority doesn't actually have any authority at all. These three people wanted to play cops and robbers in our neighborhood, but they found out that real police don't appreciate imposters. They wanted to intimidate residents with fake authority, but they discovered that real legal authority takes fraud and extortion very seriously. In the end, they got exactly what they deserved. Our community is safer and more honest than it was before, and I got to keep my light fixture exactly where I wanted it. Sometimes justice isn't just served, it's served with a side of irony that makes the whole experience even more satisfying. And the best part is that every time someone drives past my house now, they see that decorative solar light standing proudly at its full, voluntary guideline violating height, serving as a permanent reminder that some rules are meant to be broken, especially when they're not really rules at all. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I'm a custodian for an office building. I clean bathrooms, take out trash, vacuum, etc. I clean in the morning before the office opens. When collecting trash, I'd occasionally find some loose papers behind desks, beside the trash can, or otherwise on the floor. Since I'm not sure if these papers are trash that missed the can or important documents that fell on the floor by accident, I pick them up and put them on the corner of the nearest desk for the workers to either file them away or toss them. Better safe than sorry. However, the manager did not like this habit. She came in early one morning expressing disgust that trash is being placed on people's desks. Obviously, I never put actual trash like food wrappers or crumpled papers on desks. I explained my reasoning for my habit and expressed that I didn't want to risk tossing something important. My manager told me that everything on the floor is trash and the workers aren't such immature slobs to drop important documents on the floor. I agreed and said I'd never do it again. Flash forward several weeks. My manager came in early again and expressed concerns because a filing cabinet had tipped over the day, and despite picking up the papers, they were still missing a few important documents. She asked if I'd seen them. I reminded her that since everything on the floor is trash, the documents were probably thrown away. She was irate, saying, but this was an exception since a filing cabinet fell over. I asked her how I was supposed to know that when I'm not there during the day and was otherwise not informed to look out for these documents. That's when the situation dawned in this woman's eyes that she was her fault. She stumbled through some excuses before demanding I go to the dumpster and find the papers. I told her that the office was opening in 15 minutes and I still had work to do. She stormed off and said she'd start looking in the dumpster. While I cleaned, I knew I'd face her again before leaving. My car is parked by the dumpster. So I thought of what to say to her as the final nail in the coffin. Sure enough, when I finished my work and walked out, the manager and a few other wokers who'd arrived were rooting through the dumpster. When the manager spotted me, she demanded I come help. I delivered my prepared line. Ma'am, my job description is to take out trash. Your job description is to ensure the safety and confidentiality of your client's files. I walked away too, in my head, a cartoon-esque villain's scream of outraged failure from my manager. A few hours later, and I got a text saying there will now be a special inbox shelf for me to place any papers found the floor for the workers to go through. The next one is an entitled people story. It wasn't exactly a fake number, it was a doofus in my DMs who kept acting out a crush like a mean little boy in the playground. So he wouldn't stop pulling hair. And this is the kind of stuff he was saying to me. Abuse isn't real because women like it when men hit them, or they wouldn't have trouble getting out of abusive relationships where men hit them when they try to leave. Assaulted isn't real because women like when men assaulted them so they can see how much the rapist wants them, or they wouldn't have trouble leaving a rapist who hurts them when they try to leave. Women get some kind of sexual enjoyment out of violent criminals threatening them, or they wouldn't report it out of fear for their physical safety. So at that point, I'm very clear I'm in danger, and I basically told the guy some fake line about ID talk to him if he stopped. He just said he wants to assault it and hit me and doesn't see anything wrong with that. The duck. I'm not talking to him. I had to take out a restraining order because he won't stop threatening and hurting me because he thinks women are abusive when they lie for their own physical safety. He's the victim because they weren't hobist with him. Women risk their safety for Chad all the time, so they should do it for him. After he said he'd assaulted and hurt and kill them, he's the most falsely entitled, delusional abuser I've ever met. Duck your fee-fees about ma honesty. You said you wanted to ducking hit me and showed up at my home. No, women aren't being abusive, you slob, for not telling you the truth at that point. You seem like a murderer and they want to live, not collect your delusional idea of good person points. Women don't owe violent losers like that guy any shred of truth if they even think their physical safety is threatened. My dad is buying a shotgun at this point to keep this Delulu criminal away from us because he thinks being T-honesties with him is more important than a woman being safe and or alive. So, exactly what he's accused of, trying to hurt women because his fee-fees are upset. Anyway, thank you for watching.